Good day to everyone. Of course, I'm John V. Corstein, Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center. And today we're going to talk about an often overlooked naval battle that was very decisive on the Mississippi River. And that is actually the two twin engagements of Plum Point Bend and the Battle of Memphis. I've grouped them all together because actually these engagements well, like Plum Point Bend was less than 20 minutes. The Battle of Memphis was 30 minutes. These are quick engagements because they are using a different type of warships on that section of the Mississippi that actually, I would say, were outmoded virtually as soon as they were constructed, but they were very effective at a time. Complete control of the Mississippi River Valley was a key war aim for both North and South. It was critical for the Confederacy to defend the river from Union attack, to protect its major agricultural, but more importantly, its industrial centers. Memphis was an industrial center, and they made swords. They also had a old U.S. Navy yard that was taken over by J.T. Shirley, where they're building two ironclads. So you can well imagine the Confederates want to hold that. Now, likewise, the Union needed to open the Mississippi to the sea to maintain the commerce of the Midwest. All the Midwestern governors are complaining that they're going through an economic slowdown because they can't get their goods down the river to sea. So that is a serious problem. Now, the contest for the fathers of all rivers was a tremendous struggle of technology, and victory was achieved via new ship designs and industrial superiority, which the Union brought to play. Now, the Confederates rushed to build fortifications to defend these different river ports along the Mississippi. However, much more was needed. Because of the mobility of ships, those fixed fortifications were not as successful, as the Confederacy will learn, without having supporting naval elements. So this situation caused the creation of what is known as the River Defense Fleet, as well as the construction of several ironclads. The quickest way for the Confederates to build a fleet was by the acquisition of various steamers in the vicinity of New Orleans. Major General Lovell Mansfield, a West Point graduate and supposedly a true horseman from Maryland, was authorized by President Jefferson Davis to buy 14 merchant ships and to transform them into warships. Each vessel was actually fitted out as a ram by strengthening the bow of each ship, by filling the bow's interior with solid oak, planking over the forward 20 feet with oak sheathing, and then covering that section with 1 inch of iron, or railroad iron, as we would call it. The engines were actually protected by a double bulkhead, and the inner bulkhead was made of 12 inches of pine beams. The outer bulkhead was plated over with 1 inch railway iron. The space between the bulkheads, 22 inches wide, was packed with compressed cotton. This resulted in many of these rams being called cotton clads. And so when you think of cotton clads, you think of cotton piled on the bow of the ship to give sharpshooters and so forth protection. But a true cotton clad are these type of vessels. Sadly, you're seeing one right in front of us. So the Union also was going to build ironclads. The Confederates developed an ambitious ironclad construction program by which to defend the Mississippi River. 2 ironclads, Louisiana and Mississippi, were laid down at New Orleans. Another 2 were built at the J.T. Shirley Navy Yard. And that was a U.S. Navy yard that had been abandoned in the 1850s. And these two rams there are named the Tennessee and the Arkansas. And then there was one built down in Cherogogo, Gorgo, Tennessee, which was known as the Eastport. Now, the only ship that actually gets into the water for the Confederacy is going to be the Arkansas. And actually, as the Federals are moving down the river, Memphis is under so much threat that the Confederates are going to move one of the ships that was most completed, the Arkansas, up to the Yazoo River. That's another story for another time. But let's just say that they do not have the effective weaponry to defend the river. And this river defense fleet was designed to, it was actually 14 ships. 6 stayed down in Louisiana defending New Orleans, along with the Louisiana River Defense Fleet and the Confederate Navy. But 8 of these ships are sent up the river because this is just terrible what's happening to the Confederacy. John A. Stevenson commanded 6 of the rams during Farragut's attack on the Forts St. Philip and Fort Jackson. The rest were up and moved to below island number 10, actually at Fort Pillow. Flag Officer Andrew Hull-Foote's wound. Now, if we remember, Andrew Hull-Foote is a dynamic officer. He's the man that helps capture Fort Henry. He's the man that sees his ironclads, which are known as poop turtles. And these are casemated ironclads. However, they are not shockproof. They have 2.5 inches of railroad iron on them, and that's insufficient to stop most shot. So Hull, during the Battle of Fort Donelson, he is going to be grievously wounded in the ankle. The ankle does not heal. And so on May 9, 1862, I want you to remember that date, he is going to turn over command to another officer, which we'll talk about in a moment. But looking at this map, I want you to see the industrial centers that are along the Mississippi River for the Federals. And you can see that Columbus is going to be fortified by the Confederates, which violates Kentucky's neutrality. And so this will cause a big trouble. Right here, whoops, is going to be, let me go back to that. Right near New Madre is where actually island number 10 is located. Coming down the river, the next defensive point is going to be right near where T is, and it's known as Fort Pillow. So the big thing is that the Federals have a huge advantage. Now, I got to tell you, this is one of the river defense fleet. This one is armed with one gun. It's the Sterling Price. That's a 32-pounder at the bow. They really relied on ramming ships. Ramming had been very popular back during the Roman era, during the Rome against the Phoenicians, and but ramming went out of style at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where the Turks are defeated because they want to ram the Christians, and the Christians, of course, have cannon and they blow the Turks out of the water. So great victory. And so basically, we see that rams are brought back as a technique because of steam power, number one, and number two, because of ironclads. Now, the Confederates on the Mississippi River do not have the ability to actually make that many ironclads. As we see, they lose 4 or 5 before they're even finished. So this is a huge problem. Now, basically, the Federals are, this is really an Army activity, are trying to move down to capture Memphis. From Memphis, their next target was Vicksburg. They want to go inland to bring an army down towards Vicksburg, but then they also wanted to bring their ironclad and ram fleet down to Vicksburg to meet with Farragut, who's coming up from New Orleans. Now, when Hull is asked for a time off, basically to recuperate, and he will never recuperate, he'll die from that wound, was Charles Henry Davis, Flag Officer Charles Henry Davis. Now, I got to tell you, he inherited timberclads, the Lexington, Tyler, and Conestoga, as well as several city-class casemated ironclads, including the Mound City and the Cincinnati and the Cartelet. Now, basically, Davis was a graduate of Harvard, believe it or not, and spent most of his career as a scientific officer. Now, he was a member of the Blockade Strategy Board. He was also a member of the Ironclad Board, which brought us the Monitor, the Galena, but he had no real experience fighting at sea. So he is going to be Samuel Francis DuPont's chief of staff during the capture of Port Royal Sound. He then will be assigned to the river flotilla. And as a result of this, he is, as Farragut would say, Farragut asked Gideon Welles to replace Davis because Davis was plotting, very organized. However, Farragut writes, Gideon Welles says, I don't need a scholar, I need a sailor. So Davis's time is only going to be so long on the Mississippi River. This is the Battle of Island number 10. Pope's army is going to capture New Madrid, and then the Federals using mortar boats, and they had actually at the beginning of the war, John C. Fremont had advocated to create basically barges with 13-inch seacoast mortars on them to provide this heavy indirect firepower on these Confederate forts. And Hull is able to bypass island number 10 when New Madrid falls. Then we see island number 10 being abandoned. Now we see all these bends. We're going down towards Memphis. Here is Charles Henry Davis, rather dapper. Once again, remember, he's a graduate of Harvard with honors. So he is very intelligent. He just is not a combat officer. Now, another person that's going to get involved with the Federal Navy is this man, Charles Elliott Jr., excuse me. Now, Elliott is an advocate of rams, and he lobbied for rams for some time. Now, I got to tell you, Elliott was a pre-war engineer, noted for his work on railroads like the Utica-Schenectady Railroad, canals like the James River Kanawha Canal, and the construction of suspension bridges. In 1848, he built the longest wire cable suspension bridge over the Ohio River at Wheeling, West Virginia. That's the longest suspension bridge in the world. So yes, he's very intelligent. Now, actually, he worked for the federal government under contract, where he developed a system of flood control on the Mississippi. And his publication, Report of the Overflows of the Delta of the Mississippi, had a major impact on improvements of the New Orleans waterfront. Wow. So basically, He is, brilliant. So he actually takes it upon himself to go to Europe, and he knows about this tremendous event that is known as the sinking of the SS Arctic of the Collins lines. And it's going to be rammed accidentally in fog off of Newfoundland by a ship known as the SS Vesta. Now, when the Vesta rammed, she was damaged in a sinking condition, but the Arctic was in much more difficult situation and would actually sink. So Elliott goes, "Oh my gosh, this is what we need to do. We need to build rams." And so he goes down to the Crimea War. He offers this concept of rams to the Russian Navy. They say, "We don't need them." And then he goes to the US Navy, says, "We need to build ram warships," but he was rebuffed. He published a pamphlet, Coast and Harbor Defenses, or the Substitution of Steam Battery Rams for Ships of War. He published that in 1855, and he's trying to garner support for his project. His theories were ignored until 8 March 1862, when the CSS Virginia, as we all know, come out of the Elizabeth River, attacks the Union ships at Newport News Point, and rams and sinks the USS Cumberland. Now everyone's saying, "Wow, rams are it." And so as a result of that, he goes, actually, Edwin Stanton contacts him, recognizing this new mode of warfare. And so he gets a job. Edwin Stanton makes him commander, gives him the rank of colonel, and authorized him to actually build a U.S. ram fleet to serve on the Mississippi River. Now, I got to tell you, the unity of command is non-existent on the fleets operating on the Mississippi River in many ways. Elliott is an independent command, and he has only to report to Edwin Stanton. Likewise, the Pook's Turtles, the Timberclads are actually owned by the Army, but officered by the U.S. Navy personnel. However, they had to report to the Army, and this is something Navy officers do not want to do. So you can well imagine the intrepid Elliott is going to acquire. This is Fort Pillow. I'm a little early. And he has each ram with a timber bulkhead, 12 to 16 inches wide, 4 to 7 feet high, running from bow to stern. They had iron tie rods so arranged to prevent the hulls from hogging or spreading, and again when you're hitting another vessel, and also iron stays to stabilize the engine, because the bottom line is, you ram another ship, your engine can fall off the mounts. Now, Elliott's rams seemed to be perfect to counter the Confederate rams. They were faster, and yet they did not generally have any weapons, which we'll talk about soon. Now, the Confederate command structure. So now remember, the U.S. Navy, Navy officers reporting to the Army, Elliott reporting to the Secretary of War. He doesn't have to listen to anybody if he doesn't want to. So the Confederate River Defense Fleet had a nominal commander who was riverboat captain James E. Montgomery. This is the force up above Memphis. Yet in reality, it did not matter who had overall command, because when they went into the battle, it was each commander going on their own. Now, one captain, General M. Jeff Thompson, was a brigadier general of the Missouri State Guard. So he really thought he should be in command, but no one other than Thompson had any military experience. And on each battle, they just did what they wanted. Now, on this is Fort Pillow, which is a 40-gun fort located at or near this place called Plum Point Bend. All right. So what the Federals are doing, they were besieging this fort, and basically they used their ironclads to protect the mortar boats. Actually, sometimes the ironclads would tow the mortar boats down into action. So the Confederates, right, the Western Gunboat Flotilla, noticed that the USS Cincinnati was alone guarding a forward mortar boat, and the rest of the Union fleet was up at a place called Bulletin Bank. So the gunboats hoped to relieve the Union pressure on Fort Pillow by destroying one or more of the Union ironclads. So the battle's going to ensue. This is one of the Rams, Queen of the West, Union Rams. So to relieve the pressure on Fort Pillow, the Ram fleet comes up towards Fort Pillow. They catch the Cincinnati isolated, and the CSS General Bragg is going to strike first by ramming the Cincinnati on her forward bow. Now, I want to tell you, this situation is really pretty interesting. Nothing seemed to stop the Federal movement. Fort Pillow was a huge fortification, but it was stationary, located 40 miles from Memphis. After you pass Fort Pillow, you have open water to go all the way down to Mississippi. So the U.S. Navy had been shelling Fort Pillow since 14 April. We're using 13-inch Seacoast mortars. The mortar boats were towed into position, and so Elliott has 4 of his Ram fleet in service with Charles Henry Davis's Western Gunboat Flotilla. These Rams are the USS Switzerland, USS Queen of the West, which we see in front of us, and the USS Lancaster. These ships generally had no armaments. However, the Queen of the West is typical of these ships. It was built in Cincinnati in 1854, extremely fast. It was commissioned in May of 1862, and they use paddle wheels for motive power. Now, the Queen of the West is unusual because it had 3 12-pounder howitzers and 1 30-pounder rifles. Most of the others had no armament. They relied on their ram. So 8 vessels of the River Defense Fleet are going to, of course, are the CSS General Bragg, CSS Beauregard, CSS General Sterling Price, CSS General Earl Van Doren, CSS General M. Jeff Thompson, CSS Colonel Lovell, CSS General Sumter, and the CSS Little Rebel. Wow, they all sound like they're going to be special vessels. However, no 2 are alike. They're all, other than being side wheelers. Each ship generally had just 1 cannon, a 32-pounder. However, the General Bragg had the most cannons with 4 8-inch shell guns and 1 42-pounder. The Little Rebel, the flagship of the squadron, was armed with 2 32-pounder rifles and 1 32-pounder shell gun. Well, let me just tell you, the General Bragg opens this engagement by ramming the Cincinnati in her starboard quarter, which turns the Cincinnati, when they notice all these steamers coming towards them, they actually try to build up steam because their fires had been banked. The Cincinnati, now the Bragg rams into the Cincinnati, which turns the Cincinnati. So the Cincinnati's broadside guns are facing right at the General Bragg. And I've got to tell you, the muzzles are almost touching the side of the General Bragg. So what's going to happen? They fire at point blank range, and the General Bragg was totally disabled, and causing the ram to run aground. All of a sudden, the General Sterling Price will smash into the Ironclad's stern, disabling her rudder as other Union ironclad gunboats endeavor, like the USS Mound City and the USS Cartelet, to stabilize the situation. These two ironclads are going to shell the General Bragg. However, the CSS General Sumter will ram the Cincinnati one more time, causing that Cincinnati to sink. A nearby mortar boat in desperation will, lower its mortar, so it's firing in direct fashion to lob shells into the Sumter. Well, I got to tell you, they missed, and so all of a sudden another gunboat comes up. The ram, the CSS General Van Dorn, fires her two 32-pounder shells into the mortar boat and totally disables it. General Van Dorn steamed on and then rammed the Mound City. And the Mound City, of course, and then as soon as Van Dorn rams the Mound City, all of a sudden the Sumter, after finishing off the Cincinnati, will turn around and ram the Mound City itself. And the Mound City was so badly damaged that it floated off and sank in shallow waters. 2 Union ironclads have been sunk by this action. Now, all of a sudden, however, other Union ironclads come up, the USS Benton and the Cartelet, and the Benton shelled and damaged the General Lovell, and the Cartelet sent a shot into the Sumter's borders, which exploded, causing heavy casualties. Other Union gunboats arrive, and so what's left of the River Defense Fleet falls down river. Now to Memphis. Now they're victorious, but they're heavily damaged because just the whole act of ramming shakes your ship and oftentimes does more damage to your ship than it does to the ship you're ramming. Now, the Battle of Plum Point Bend may have been considered a minor Confederate victory, yet the Federals are going to be able to raise the Mound City in the Cincinnati so that soon they will be back in action. Wow. So the River Defense Fleet retreats to Memphis. Now, Corinth, which was a railroad center that sent its railroads to Memphis, basically, Corinth was captured by a federal operation led by General Henry Halleck. So Memphis is isolated. The Confederates remove all their troops. So the Memphis is an open city. However, so realizing that, what is the Western Gunboat Flotilla going to do? Now, this is the Battle of Fort Pillow. It's called the Naval Battle of Fort Pillow. And you can see there's the Cincinnati, there's the General Bragg, and basically you can see what a confusing battle that's unfolding in front of everyone. And the Federals can't get their ironclads into action quick enough. And so this leads to a Confederate victory. This is the USS Benton, not a poop turtle, but on similar design concept. Notice the center wheel. This ship is going to be the backbone at this time. After losing the Mound City and the Cincinnati, it is the backbone of the Union ironclads. Now, that was May 10th, 1862. However, Fort Pillow will fall and the Federal fleet moves down towards Memphis. Now, basically, the uh, River Defense Fleet, they try to get enough coal, so they're ordered to go down to Vicksburg. However, there's not enough coal in Memphis for them to use. So as a result of that, they have to stay in Memphis and fight out with the Union fleet. Now, on the morning of June 10th, everyone knows a battle is going to happen. You see the smoke from the Union fleet coming down, and then there is the River Defense Fleet. So thousands of people line the riverbank of Memphis to see the success they dream of, but with the gunboat flotilla. Now, Davis is going down towards Memphis with 4 ironclads, the Benton, Louisville, and the Cartelet, the Cairo, and the St. Louis in a line abreast, but they're moving down the river with their stern facing the enemy. And so they stood downriver, sterns first, and they engage at long range the River Defense Fleet. So they have superiority in weaponry. So that means that this is not going well for the Confederates from the very beginning. Now, what's going to happen? Charles Elliott Jr. is behind the Ironclads, and Elliott all of a sudden decides, well, I'm going to rush past them and going to go down and ram the Confederate ships. Well, Elliott's flagship, the Queen of the West, right, is going to be followed astern by the USS Monarch, and they head towards the Confederates using their greater speed to rapidly engage. Elliott's flagship, the Queen of the West, struck first when it rammed the CSS Colonel Lovell so hard it smashed it. It actually almost split it in two. The Queen of the West was also badly damaged and managed to sink in shallow waters. Colonel Elliott is going to be the only Union casualty of this entire battle. He is going to be shot in the knee. Some people say by a sharpshooter, other by a pistol shot. It doesn't matter. He gets shot in the knee, and he refuses to have his leg amputated. It gets infected, and then when they're taking him up north for treatment, he contracts measles, and he's going to die on the 21st June, 1862. So his concept almost dies with him, but nevertheless, at the Battle of Memphis, it proves to be extremely successful. The Monarch follows the Queen of the West. 2 Confederate rams, the General Beauregard and the General Sterling Price, attempt to ram the Monarch on each side. Their idea is, we're going to smash it between us. However, the Monarch eluded those 2 ships because it was faster. And when that happens, instead of ramming the Union ram, the 2 Confederate ships rammed each other head on. I've got to tell you, General Beauregard tore off the entire starboard paddle wheel box of the Sterling Price. Of course, that disabled the ship. Now, somehow, both of the ships make it to the Arkansas shoreline, where they're going to be destroyed by gunfire by the Ironclads. The Monarch then chased down the General Beauregard, and the vessel was forced ashore and abandoned by the Confederates. They set it afire. The Ironclads are now shooting up the other Confederate rams, like the General M. Jeff Thompson, and they also, by their gunfire, force the little rebel ashore, and then they capture the General Sumter. Only the General Earl Van Dorn escapes and goes up into the Yazoo River, where it will be later scuttled. the battle oh, look at this. This is pretty awesome. Uh, you you can just see the force of these rams, and this is a melee. I mean, this there is no real organized command on either side. Davis can't control Elliott. Davis is plotting. He knows he has the superior firepower and so forth. Elliott is, even though he's an engineer, I think he's a little crazy by the way he wants to use his ships. Of course, he'll suffer from that. Um, and in essence, the destruction of the River Defense Fleet here at Memphis, and you can see Memphis in the background of this picture. Imagine thousands of people cheering, then all of a sudden they've got nothing to cheer about. And so that makes it pretty sad. Now, the loss of Memphis is a severe blow to the Confederacy. Why? It had a naval yard. It had manufacturing. The Confederacy or the South had begun to industrialize some of its major cities using water power to man factories. So basically, but they just don't have enough. The destruction of the River Defense Fleet means that the Confederacy only has a few ships that have gone up the White River or the Red River or the Yazoo River. And actually, their main ship they have after the Battle of Memphis is going to be the CSS Arkansas. And that ship is going to have to fight the entire Union fleet when it finally emerges from the Yazoo River. But that's another story. So, what have we learned today? Well, I'm going to say that number one, the concept of rams became very popular. In fact, the design of rams are fitted into hulls of ships as they're built. If you look at the hull of the CSS Albemarle, you'll see how it's designed to have a built-in ram that protrudes from the bow. Actually, we will build ships as rams as late as the 1890s. And you just look like when they launched the Kentucky and Kearsarge here at the Newport News Shipyard, you can see the ram bow. Now, the big thing is rams quickly become obsolete. They become obsolete because of the new type of naval gunnery. However, there is a battle in Europe, the Battle of Lissa, where the Austrians will defeat the Italians by using that same ramming tactic. In fact, one wooden ship of the line, the Kaiser, will actually lose its entire bow when it rams into an Italian ironclad. So rams have a quick use during the Civil War, which has a legacy that lasts 30 more years. The Confederacy never had the ability to really defend the Mississippi River. Their only hope was to build those ironclads, and out of the 5 laid down, only one will survive until it will be destroyed by their own crew after a spectacular service near Vicksburg. But we'll talk about that another time. So I want to tell you, you can see all the sinking Confederate ships. This is once again, this is a different sketch that is done by Alonzo Chappelle, and you can just see the devastation of this is the ramming of the Monarch, or the Monarch ramming, and basically breaking apart the Confederate ship. And notice this is actually the Monarch. It almost splits the General Bragg in two. But once again, the Federals are able to now have Memphis. Their next goal is to capture Vicksburg, which will be a much tougher nut to crack. These are the ships that really make the U.S. Navy on the Mississippi. This is, of course, a poop turtle known as the Cairo. You can actually go visit the Cairo at Vicksburg. It's wonderful. Of course, you can also visit the Monitor here at the Mariners Museum. And so that's my story. I hope if you have any questions or comments, please just bring them on. I find the whole idea of ramming so spectacular. I am working on a publication that dealing with ramming that goes all the way back to the Greco-Roman times, and so especially the Battle of Lepanto. So anyway, um, uh, do you have any questions? If you don't have them directly for me, you could also email me and directly, and I will try to answer everything I can.
We do have some questions, John. Thank you
Okay,
all for being with us today. We do have questions. John, you're grooming the next generation of Civil War enthusiasts. We have Micah and Thaddeus, second and third graders, with us today from Suffolk.
great.
Um, Micah would like to know what other weapons were used besides cannons.
Well, if you're talking about naval, right? So you have three types of cannon that are used in naval battles and in coastal defense forts. You would have a shell gun, generally 8, 9, 11-inch shell guns. They were really developed by Henry Paxton-Hans, but then uh, John Dahlgren, John Adolphus Bernard Dahlgren will develop the Dahlgren gun. And that is able to withstand the pressures of firing a shell, which needed greater explosive or greater power to fire. So you have a shell gun, then you had rifled guns, and rifle guns are going to prove to be the most superior naval weapon during the Civil War and thereafter, because it, of course, runs into brick. Now, you can go down to Beaufort, North Carolina, and see Fort Macon, where basically that fort was defeated because the Federals had rifled 30-pounder Parrott guns. Then, of course, those are direct fires. Then you had mortars, which were indirect fire. So that's why when we talked about Fort Pillow, while it was being besieged, we have mortars, we have shell guns, and we have rifles with the Union fleet. So the other weapon they could use were rams. And that meant the ship itself was a weapon. And, when the CSS Virginia sinks the Cumberland, as she rams it, she actually fires a 7-inch Brook rifle, and which decimates an entire gun crew, pivot gun crew. And the ship is actually destroyed by that one moment. Now, the navies had those four types of weaponry they use: the ship themselves, mortars, rifles, and shell guns.
Very good. Thank you.
My pleasure.
RJ asked, what does your research show regarding Confederate casualties, dead and wounded at Plum Point and Memphis?
Well, at Memphis, they had 15 killed. Um, most of the rest of the Confederates, when the Union captures ships like the General Beauregard, they've all escaped. So it's really limited casualties. The Sumter at the Battle of Plum Point Bend loses 4/5 of its crew because its boiler will be burst by a shot. And that actually kills and wounds 80 people. So, but these are relatively low casualty events because they're quick. Battle of Plum Point Bend is done in less than 20 minutes because the Confederates come in, ram, turn around. We got to get out of here, because now come the Ironclads. So at Memphis, it is a 29-minute engagement, only so long because of the plotting of Davis's Ironclads. Elliott can't take it anymore, so he runs past the Ironclads to ram the Confederate fleets.
Before I forget to ask my question, I'm going to
Well,
get to everybody else's. But was measles a serious problem for others? You mentioned Elliott died of it.
yes. Well, we think Elliott died from a combination of an infected wound, which wouldn't have happened had he had his leg amputated, but he didn't want to. And if you're a colonel, you could say no, don't cut it off. I think my favorite story about that is Franklin Buchanan, who's wounded at the Battle of Mobile Bay. He's taken to Warrington Navy Yard in Pensacola. Doctors come to Buchanan and says, "Oh, your wound is very dangerous. We think we should amputate your leg. What would you like us to do?" And Buchanan looked at him and says, "Well, you captured it. You decide." Well, but measles reportedly killed about 5,000 soldiers during the Civil War. It was a childhood disease, but what you have is all these people who live in little towns, all come together with a big group. They have no herd immunity against certain diseases. So measles was a serious killer during the Civil War, or was very debilitation. Many people survived it, but it would. I had measles. I remember that. I think I was 5 years old, but I really remember having it. Yeah. So that's uh, so measles. Yes, was deadly. Just probably most deadly was dysentery, diarrhea, typhoid fever. Typhoid fever comes from bad water, and so they drank a lot of bad water. Um, okay.
Rosemary asked, was the Queen of the West the same ship that Cornelius Vanderbilt had built and sold to Morgan for mail delivery?
No, it is not.
Different Queen of the West.
Yes.
John asked, did the Union not build a super ram at the end of the Civil War, which was ultimately sold to a European power?
Oh, well, they sure did. They built two of them. One was known as the Dundenberg, and the other one is the Sputin Devil. And they're built up in New York, and they're finished at the end of the war. They'll be sold to France. Yes, they did. I can't say they were super rams, but the Sputin Devil was more of a torpedo boat than a ram. It couldn't mount any cannons. It's actually a bad design. The U.S. Navy got lucky to sell it off. The Dundenberg was not fast enough to really deploy its ram as intended. I think I'm doing a program sometime this fall where I'm going to talk about the other Union ironclads, the different designs, such as the Dundenberg. So
you are. I think it's later in the fall. You are.
yes, I thought so. I can only remember what I'm doing today or what happened in 1862 today.
There you go. Well, Micah's brother Thaddeus would like to know, what is the most powerful of all ironclads?
Well, I think from terms of the Civil War and here in America, the monitors, had limited firepower, and so they are not the best. They're also not seaworthy. The new Ironsides was a casemated ironclad with good armor and everything, but she just never is successful, if that makes sense. There are all these, it's the first of its class. So if you were to ask me what is the best ironclad that was on either team, it would be the CSS Stonewall. The Stonewall had heavy rifled cannons. It had one bad ram, and it had good armor protection. It was made in France, so but it was able to make it to the to Cuba in June of 1865. So it was too late to actually serve. The Union Navy feared it because it had speed, it had good armor, it had excellent Armstrong guns, rifles, and then that ram was just like the ram you would see on the Kearsarge or Kentucky, built in the 1890s. And so um, there are a couple of river ironclads that are fairly effective. The trouble with the poop turtles is that they don't have enough iron. Um, they will make a couple of different designs, but they're never quite good enough. The trouble is they don't plate the paddle wheels sufficiently. And so that is the weakness of all river-based ironclads, other than the twin-turreted monitors that, like the Chickasaw, that is going to fight at the Battle of Mobile Bay.
Well, and you have a program on the Stonewall in June.
I do.
Yep. So
Okay, thanks.
so look for that, all of us.
Yeah.
We have more questions.
Okay.
Kevin would like to ask about, were the Confederates able to build steam engines at Memphis or New Orleans?
Actually, they could build them in New Orleans. They could build them at Memphis. Now, because New Orleans was a big shipbuilding center. Memphis was a big shipbuilding center. They're building riverboats. The trouble is the engines they built were like walking beam engines for paddle wheels. So they actually, by 1862, you needed to use screw propellers. So your machinery was beneath the waterline. And therein lies the weakness of the engines that are produced in the Confederacy. They actually can produce them in Selma and Birmingham as well. These are burgeoning industrial centers, I have to say. And yet, once again, the engines are designed for the wrong purpose, or wrong type of engine system to be effective during the Civil War.
Kevin also asked, was railroad iron armor actual rails, or
Yes.
rails rolled out into plates?
Actually, when they use the term railroad iron, see, the Confederacy tore up railroads that led, as Daniel Harvey Hill said, to alien territories. I guess the little Union soldiers were actually green Martians wearing blue suits. But the bottom line is they take that iron and they would then roll it into plate. So it becomes iron plate versus railroad iron. The CSS Arkansas actually will use T-rails, right? Because when you're building an ironclad or finishing an ironclad in Yazoo City, you're not going to get the best ironclad. So they actually take up rails and they mount them back to back like that. And actually, Arkansas had 4 inches of railroad iron on her. So when you say the word railroad iron, you're meaning they're taking ties and plating or covering the ship with that type of iron. When you hear plated iron, in many cases, especially in the South, it's railroad iron that has been sent to either Slocum and Markham in Atlanta or up to Tredegar, where they have annealing furnaces where you can take that iron and roll it into 2-inch iron plate.
Andrew wonders about ramming as a tactic. On balance, was it a good tactic? Was it highly unlikely tactic that occasionally had spectacular results?
Well, I would say if you base it on the Confederate experience, their rams were, I mean, I'll tell you, the Albemarle sinks the Southfield by ramming, the CSS Virginia, which has an added ram to it. But, John Mercer Brooke understood, and so did John Luke Porter, the chief naval constructor for the Confederacy, that if you're iron plated, a wooden ship can fire all at once at you because the shot's going to bounce off and you're going to be able to ram that other ship. And so your ship becomes a weapon. You just have to make sure that you have the engine motive power to get in reverse fast enough, because both the Virginia and the Albemarle almost sank when they ram the respective Cumberland and the Southfield. So was that effective? Well, yes, I think it was until they improve armaments so that they can blow you out of the water at 10 miles. So you can't get to ram. But Admiral Tegethoff at the Battle of Lissa in 1866 kind of proves the power of the ram. And but once again, it's going to get outmoded by improvements in armaments. So all the Confederate ironclads, they feature rams for various reasons. The Virginia, one reason is because they didn't have a lot of gunpowder. So they said, oh, well, what we'll do is we'll just ram everybody and they'll sink those ships. And that was proven to be true.
Well, Lauren brings up that speed and maneuverability would certainly be advantageous in avoiding a ram. But did
Yeah, but
ships have superior engines in their vessels?
yes, they do. The Sometimes you just like the Cincinnati, it was sitting there, engines bank. All of a sudden, here comes the Confederates, so they got to build up their fires, and it's a sitting duck. Even though they don't even have their gun, they don't fire their guns at the approaching Confederate ram. But once the Confederate ram rams the Cincinnati, it forces the Cincinnati to come alongside of the Confederate ram, and as a result, they fire their broadside into the Confederate ram, making that ram no longer functioning. So I would say speed, maneuverability was a big factor. But when you think about how the Civil War at sea is fought, is mostly fought in rivers and bays and sounds, so that it is a combination of iron and effective engines and armaments that are going to make you successful. I mean, the Albemarle on June 5th, 1864 will hold off the entire Union fleet, even though it only has two 6.4-inch Brooke rifles. It rams ships. All Confederate ships suffer from weak engine systems, but the Federals don't tend to use ramming as a tactic um, in any major way during the war.
Well, speaking of Brooke weaponry, Randy asked, how does the Confederate Brooke rifled cannon compare to the U.S. Parrott rifled cannon in penetration of armor capability?
Well, let me just tell you, the finest rifled gun of the Civil War was designed by John Mercer Brooke. He added in 6.4-inch and 7-inch designs. His guns were superior over the Parrott guns for several reasons. Number one, you get the higher caliber Parrott guns. They have one single band, and how they banded it was to make a cast iron gun. Then they got wrought iron band, and they heated everything up, put the band on it, and then shot cold water jets down the barrel to cool it so it adheres to the gun. Well, that's a little too quick. So those bands were not effective, especially when they were in larger calibers. They were known to burst. Most of the Union naval casualties during the attack on Fort Fisher are from 100-pounder, 150-pounder Parrots bursting. I would not want to be on a Parrot gun. Only now Brooke not only double and triple banded his guns, he shot warm jets of water down the barrel as those bands are being put on, which is a slower but more effective cooling process on the guns. Only one Brooke rifle burst, and it was at Cummings Point Battery down in Charleston. And when Brooke heard about it, he went down to Charleston and met with the survivors of the gun crew, said, "What did you do?" And they said, "Well, we double shotted it." And you can't double shot a rifle, so that's why it burst. And so they're just, I guess, dumb hicks who said, "Golly gee, let's do this," and it didn't work. And so I shouldn't say dumb hicks. I just don't think they understood the technologies of a rifled gun and the stresses that come from the explosion. It's an explosion in the barrel, so all these gases, they want to escape, so you want to funnel them into the shot so that it captures the 7 lands and grooves and reaches out and touches the enemy. So also, I'm not finished. Wait a second, I forgot. Brooke actually developed the first armor-piercing shot, which is known as the Brooke bolt. So what gun could actually penetrate armor the best? It would be the Brooke gun. One Brooke gun at the Battle of Drury's Bluff on May 15, 1862, at a 300-yard range, hit the monitor right at where the turret is in its ring at the deck, and spins into it about 3 inches deep. Now, had you had a Brooke bolt when the Virginia is fighting the Monitor at less than 20 feet, could it have pierced that armor? I'm not sure, but whenever the Monitor is drained and you're able to be on a tour, you will see that very screw in from that Brooke bolt. That's my answer.
Well, and Fran DeCoin with us today. That's wonderful. And Fran, I'm sure, has seen just what you talked about being inside the turret, but he has a question.
Oh, of course he does.
The CSS Stonewall versus USS Minnetonka, I cannot say that word.
Minnetonka, yeah. Minnetonka,
one of those Indian Native American.
Yeah, I don't know why they did that, because you couldn't pronounce your own shit oftentimes. But yes, the only thing about the Minnetonka, I think. I got taught the original pronunciation. I can't really remember it right now. The big trouble is the Stonewall's ram protruded 12 feet from its bow. So if you think about a Monitor design, you have that heavy armored deck, but then beneath it is boilerplate 1 inch where the hull is, where everything's going on. So what the Stonewall would do if it was going to ram that type of ship. Now remember, they have 15-inch Dahlgrens on board. Now 15-inch Dahlgren is really an ironclad killer, because at the Battle of Mobile Bay, we know what happens to Tennessee, we know what happens to the Atlanta, and so forth. But I do believe that the time of loading and firing those 15-inch guns versus the speed and ability, the Stonewall has better guns on it than does the Mini Molotov. So I would have to judge that the Stonewall would sink that double-turreted ironclad.
Okay.
If not with its 300-pounder Armstrong gun, it would surely do so with that ram, because it was faster. Stonewall was faster than the Mini Molotov. So anyway, it's supposed to be an ocean-going ironclad, but I would not go out to sea with that. Tell you the truth.
Well, and we're going to Google how to say that, so won't be embarrassed next time.
Right.
And one last question from Andrew. And Andrew, if you didn't get to see it, the public television did a series called Mercy Street. Wasn't that the name of that hospital?
Yes, it was.
And it was filmed in Virginia, and it was excellent and gives you a really very lifelike view of medicine during the Civil War. But Andrew's question was, it seems they didn't understand much about infection. How is it that a shrapnel or bullet wound could get infected, but not an amputation?
Oh, well, amputations could get infected as well. I mean, if you were shot in the hip and have to have your leg cut off at the hip, it was 3 out of 100 who would survive that. So the actually cutting of the leg off could get infected. So it was, when your leg is shattered, they had no way, they didn't use pins and things like that. So they had no way of knitting bones back together. That caused, if the bones are loose in there, it's going to continue to bleed. Now, if anyone saw Master and Commander, right, and the doctor, I can't remember his name now, but he gets shot in the side. But what makes his wound infected was that the bullet took a piece of shirt into him, and that shirt was dirty. Therefore, you add dirt. One of my favorite stories is Lieutenant Andrew Snowden, or Major Andrew Snowden, who at the Battle of Cedar Mountain, he was an artillery officer, was on his horse. A shell whishes by his stomach and creates a big gash in his skin. So his intestines, you want to fall out. So he grabs them and he rolls off his horse onto his back. And everyone walks by, you're dead. And finally he pulls out his gun and says, take me to the hospital. And so they did, because he had a Lamat revolver, so that's kind of dangerous. So they take him to the hospital. The doctors go by, you're dead. And Snowden says, no, I'm not. And pulls out his gun, says, you sew me up. Well, they did. And so he recovers. The doctor that did that operation goes, oh my gosh, how does someone's intestines who are rolling out get stuck back in and survive? Well, he deduced that as Snowden fell off, Snowden Andrews fell off his horse, his intestines rub against the horse's neck. The horse has hot sweat. And so what that doctor did was keep hot horse sweat, and he'd sprinkle every wound with that. Now, they'd been better off if they just poured the whiskey they had on the wound, but they didn't do that. And because that would have really, I think when COVID first came out, I actually used a vodka to wash my hands sometimes, and that really was the solution in some ways.
That was your Friday afternoon solution.
Yes, that's right.
Well, thank you everyone for attending today. We appreciate your being with us. John's blog will post about the Battle of Memphis soon. So take a look on our blogs for that to post. His lecture from last Friday, as Tim said earlier, will post on YouTube tomorrow, which was New Bern to Beaufort, North Carolina, Burnside's expedition. And next Friday, we'll explore a different era of naval warfare with John, which will be the birth of American aircraft carriers here in Hampton Roads. That will be at noon with Thomas Heinrich, an author and professor at City University of New York, that will be talking about his book, Industrial Shipbuilding, from World War I to World War II. And then for our Civil War fans on May 21st, John will be back at noon to talk about Ben Butler and the contrabands just across the creek here from where I am, and we're down the creek from where John lives. And we look forward to having you with us. All these programs, even though we're reopening soon, we will continue the virtual programs because we see how many of you enjoy them and are with us from near and far. And with that, happy Mother's Day to all our dear mothers. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
I just want to say, as most of the Confederates said, sink before surrender. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Bye bye.